Welcome to the Martin, Sieff, and Pelle Neroth Taylor show, and increasingly the Hall Gardner show. He's with us today.
No. Right
It's
on.
Capitals Uncovered, and we're doing a show about Chinese poetry and literature, following on from the a French discussion program. This country, which is so proud of its intellectuality, invited three top French thinkers on the other day in their main discussion program, and none of them could mention a French, Chinese personality, a living personality beyond Xi Jinping. I'm not saying I'm very expert on Chinese history or literature or anything, but these are, after all, the self-proclaimed top intellectuals in Europe's most intellectual country. So that's where we are in Europe at the moment. We don't know anything about what's beyond the West in our increasingly multipolar world. So Hall Gardner, who lived in China and has written a couple of novels and collections of poetry based on his experiences, I think, as a teacher, was it? But you were around then during the uh, God,
Yeah, I
the
was a professor at the Johns Hopkins Nanjing Centre in Nanjing
in
during
1989.
1988,
Yeah.
89. So I
Okay.
was there during the Tiananmen Square
That's right.
protests, which were nationwide. They weren't just taking place in Beijing. And at that time, because I was out of Beijing, LA Times took my editorials about what was going on. The editor told me he wanted me rather than somebody placed in Beijing to show that it wasn't just a Beijing phenomenon. And I mean, I wasn't expecting to get the job in the first place. It was quite by accident that I got it, but it forced me to really study what Chinese culture, history, poetry, and to get an understanding of what was happening there. And I came up with some conclusions which weren't the status quo. For example, I argued way back in 1989 that watch out for the new authoritarians. They were more had more power than the so-called multi-party democratic movement. And in fact, I was right. Xi Jinping is a new authoritarian. He's taken over. He's broken up the communist oligarchy. It wasn't the Democrats that won, but what all my colleagues are saying, oh, there'll be young people and they're all going to break out into democracy. It's all going to be wonderful and all this. And I had my doubts way back in 1989. So that's one of the themes of my novel, two novels on the subject.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. And you were gonna
and anyway, the point is that, yeah, go ahead.
no, no. Uh, I mean, it's astonishing that we're so ignorant about so-called non-Western cultures, and it's almost. I just tell a little anecdote. I mean, I was uh, I talked to a scholar of the history between in Europe between the sixth and the 10th centuries. And he was quoted, he was talking about poets and writers and things like that, in the Anglo-Saxons that I never heard of. And I didn't even know this, barely knew this period
Mhm.
existed. And I felt so ignorant because I can normally navigate my way around the literary and news pages. Increasingly, I find the literary pages, I guess you guys, as you're even more educated than I am, found even more strongly that they've become more trivial. I think they've objectively become more trivial, and then we're older, so we know more relative to the young literary editors. But I feel in control of the media situation. I know that, but when you suddenly bounce these Chinese names, or as this guy talking about literature of the sixth to 10th centuries, I hadn't heard of a single name.
Mhm.
We've got to educate ourselves, haven't we, Hall? Just to feel, for our
Yeah.
sense of, I don't know, well-being, or just to feel like an educated modern person, don't we? And you're going to talk to us about. I
Well,
mean, it's a long journey that we have to be on, but you're going to at least allow us to dip our
I'll
toes.
try. I'm not an expert either in China, but I lived it for a year, and I watched what was happening in China during the Tiananmen Square events. And it was quite an effective. But that forced me to really live it. So my novel didn't come out for what, more than 30 years later. So
Right.
I had to absorb everything that was happening to me. But get back to your point there. Many years ago in Washington, when I lived in Washington, I wrote the Washington Post and said, why don't you put some poetry in the magazine? In your newspaper, that's what they do in Latin America. Many Latin American newspapers have poetry, and other ones do. I never got an answer from them, but the next week or 2 weeks later, they put Lionel Richie, which was a really, when you hear rock music and you just read the words without the music, it's garbage.
Mm.
And I've always tell that to my students. If you want to understand poetry, you got to read the words. Read the words to the rock music, and you'll find that most of them are garbage and not poems. And anyway, the point is that that's what we need. We need more cultural more exposition of poetry in the newspaper, in the media, not just poetry, but any form of arts. And just to get people to know that people writing in China way back in the 300 BC are as relevant today as anybody. It's amazing. That's what I was going to try to point out today.
Well,
Qu
I mean,
Yuan
we've taken on board a lot of Russian culture in literature, the 19th
yeah,
century writers, um, but not the Chinese, not so. So
right.
actually,
I
it
wanted to
precedes us.
do my thesis, in fact, my undergraduate thesis on Russian literature and 19th century literature in general, and compare it
Right.
with history and politics, but they wouldn't let me,
Oh,
so I had to do a normal
okay.
thesis at the time. But yeah, I mean, I don't understand. I mean, I've been studying NATO and Russia for years, and the reason I think I can understand Russia is not from the politics, but from Dostoevsky and from other Russian writers that I think help you understand the attitude of the Russians, even though I don't speak the language, I don't speak Chinese either. And I think you learn from the culture.
Mm,
And of course, you're not going to be perfect, but you can at least get a better comprehension of what that culture is about through their literature.
mm.
And I recommend that for anybody and for any culture. If you're
So the
trying to
foreign
understand,
policy magazines
read
and
the
so
great
on.
novels first,
Yeah.
read the great poetry of that culture before you go and live there.
It ought to
You
be in order to
understand?
diplomats and all these people writing about the Chinese threat and the Russian threat and foreign policy and foreign affairs. They ought to get out a bit more and start reading Chinese poetry,
Well, the
right?
Chinese are the most sophisticated. You just look at their history and how they dealt with different peoples and revolutions and everything else. They've got everything in their history, and so they're well aware of what's going on, and they're a lot smarter. Believe me, China right now is winning with this stupid war in Iraq, Iran, excuse me, and with Russia. China's just sitting there watching us. It's two, as Mao put it, two monkeys. A monkey watching two tigers fight. That was Mao's
Mm.
expression. And that's what's happening. They're watching the
So
Americans, the Russians,
tell us about
Iranians
the
fight.
poetry that you're going to introduce to us today.
Yeah. Well, Q Yuan was a diplomat and poet. He wrote a thing called what's called in Heavenly Questions. It was about why the Chu Empire was defeated by the Qin Empire at that time in the war, and it's so relevant to anything. I mean, he tried to get his king to, you know, get rid of the corruption so they could at least defend themselves against this horrible Qin Empire that was literally about to conquer all of China. They were about the last state to go. It's very interesting because the Qin Empire was a landlocked empire that wanted to expand to the sea. The Chu Empire that Q Yuan was a minister was a insular or near the water, and the Qin Empire just gradually took over. And part of the problem was that Q Yuan could not convince his king that this was that they were treated going to that they were engaged in treachery. That when they wanted to engage in diplomacy, it was really a false effort, and that they really were going to take over the country. So this poem about the called the Heavenly Questions, that's its general title. I call it the Cosmic Questions. It's really great because it's not just a question. It questions universe, why we exist, why this, but at the same time, it mixes those questions as why in the hell are we losing this war? And it's all mixed together in a way that as I said, I'm not an expert in Chinese language, but you can tell from the way the questions are formulated. It's just a series of questions, and it undermines Chinese mythology. It undermines why the different myths were created. What did they mean? At the same time, it's undermining the power structure and why the king is making decisions when he's being corrupted by concubines and by other elements that are interfering in the Chu kingdom. And it's just such a powerful poem. I uh, um, I used it for both my novels, uh, both in the as a statement of the individuals who are resisting dictatorship and totalitarianism even if they're on the losing side. And this to me was what was happening in China at the time. Those individuals who were standing up for what they saw as democracy and human rights, or at least anti-corruption. I think that's an important part. They were anti-corruption,
Mm.
whether they were Democrat or not, and lose out. And over time, as I said earlier, it wasn't the Democrats, the multi-party Democrats that won.
Mm.
It was the neo-authoritarians, what they're called, that new authoritarians in China. They were hardcore liberals, um, tried to reduce the role of the Communist Party, and establish an authoritarian, which they finally got in Xi Jinping in 2013. But it took a while for that to evolve out of Tiananmen Square. And what's interesting is how the Communist Party used the democratic movement, took over what the democratic movement was advocating in A, trying to eliminate corruption, but done in an authoritarian manner through, but also eliminating the Communist Party oligarchy and creating a kind of neoliberal enterprise system where the bigger corporations profited, and the Communist Party is controlling those, many of the Communist Party members
Mhm.
controlling those corporations. So it was liberal in that sense, and really took over and co-opted the entire movement. And
Mhm.
people don't come about. Nobody's talking about that, how that happened. And I watched that happen
Mhm.
over the years.
And sorry, the alternative rebels were the ones in the 90s that they didn't get anywhere. Could you just contrast them to the true Democrats and the one who were co-opted by the communists?
Yeah, you had two branches.
Right.
You had inside the movement, and it was a popular movement, and even the peasants would stand out and give the students money. It wasn't. It was really a
Mm.
strong movement. You had two sides on the devil. You had those who wanted reform within the Communist
Mm.
Party, and you had those that wanted a multi-party system.
Mm.
And then you had the new authoritarians, which were a different breed, who wanted to just break the Communist Party and establish a dictatorship, but a good authoritarian, a new authoritarian.
And they were
And that's what
sidelined.
they were sidelined at that time,
Mm.
but they are the ones who won out in the long run.
Oh, I see. Okay. Martin, what are your
Xi
thoughts?
Jinping won.
Yeah.
The ones that were sidelined and were crushed were the multi-party Democrats. The ones
Right.
that wanted reform within the Communist Party were saying, okay, we'll accept some reforms. You can critique ecology. You can critique some elements of Chinese society, particularly the pollution and things like that, which were horrific, and nobody could stand against
Okay.
those.
Before I ask Martin, I mean, so just do you think? I mean, does this relate to your poetic theme? Did they use? I mean, I thought it was very telling, isn't it? The one thing I remember from Tiananmen Square was that they had a plaster Statue of Liberty. Do you remember that? And
Yep,
we
yep.
thought, well, isn't that funny that they're using an American symbol? Where are the domestic symbols? But maybe they had lots of domestic symbols. It's only we're not trained to recognize
Yeah,
them.
that was a real problem, and they tried to call it freedom and liberty. I think they were trying to blend a little bit of a little bit of Chinese with Western culture there, and there was a lot of problem. But the students that I met and talked to at that time, and this is part of my first novel, You're the Earth Serpent, changing colors because it was changing from red, but it wasn't changing to red, white, and blue. It was changing to red and brown. It was changing
Exactly.
to fascist. And that's what I mean by new authoritarian. New authoritarianism is the kind of fascism that centralizes all. And that's where we get back to Yuan, who is fighting legalism. Legalism was the fascism of its time, and legalism was the doctrine that took over when the King Empire conquered the Chu Empire. So my point is, there's all these parallels from then to now in my book,
And
the
was
novel.
Yuan used by the Democrats as a figure of a leadership,
Oh,
moral
oh yeah.
leadership?
He historically he stands for those opposed to oppression. It's an annual ritual where people dump glutinous rice in the lake. He drowned himself after the Chu Empire was conquered. He drowned himself, and to this day, every year the Chinese dump glutinous rice into the lake to protect his body because it was going to be eaten by the fish. And there's even a story about this is where ecology comes in. There's a story of a dolphin trying to save him, but it's impossible. The body's already destroyed. And but the point is this yearly ritual is a part of Chinese culture and history. And no, because what did the Qin Empire do? It smashed all the different cultural differences within all the different Chinese kingdoms of that time and centralized. And that's why China at that time became very powerful in its region because they centralized everything, but destroyed all the different cultures and languages, variations of Chinese and other languages and cultures that exist. They wiped out the Taoist priests and Buddhists and whatever, and put legalists in charge. Legalist Shan Yang was what legalist I talk about in the book, and he becomes one of the what I consider the neoconservatives of the era, if you're going to compare it to that or somebody else who just believes that right is might.
So is Q
Fourth
Yuan
Confucianism.
accepted in China today? I mean, do they allow him to be published, or is he kind of a dissident poet or writer that's banned?
Well, Qiyana, well, as I said, he's really everybody knows the cosmic questions. You can't get it out of the literature, and how it's related, how QAnon is seen. I don't know how the young generation sees him, but that's certainly the way I
Does
interpret it.
today's Communist Party see him as a threat, or do they just have they just absorbed him as well?
I think they just absorbed it. You know, we've got
Yeah,
this. Adopted this so-called Confucianism, which I think is bullshit. They're legalists. They're not Confucianists,
right.
and that's what I've been arguing for years. You know, you have these Confucian. The U.S. has tried to eliminate some of these Confucian think tanks that have gone on. I don't know how extensive they are in Europe, but China tried to show that it was a new Confucian culture, and really Confucian really has nothing to do with the whole Communist Party structure. It's really legalist, and the legalism was a highly authoritarian system, and it was really eliminated any criticism of the of authority.
Mm. Martin, sorry, you want to say?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm basically on the side of the legalists because what else is there? You're talking about a giant. Gandhi, Mohandas K. Gandhi, made a very interesting comment, and I have actually a different answer than the one that's usually given to him, but the question was wonderful. Gandhi was asked what he thought of Western civilization and political freedom, democracy, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought it was a wonderful idea. Someone should try it sometime, he said. I would say the problems that liberals face in China is that not once, but repeatedly over the past 200 years, Western, and it's the same situation we see in Russia, which is why we not only have President Putin in Russia today, but whoever replaces President Putin is going to be far more dangerous to the West,
Yeah,
far
well,
more
I
dangerous.
agree.
Well, exactly. You and I have discussed this at length. We both recognize this. But why is that? And you and I both know the answer to this very all too well, Hall, as you know. For you and me, it's very familiar territory. And I was actually there repeatedly on the ground, and I read Russian reasonably fluently. I speak it very badly, but I can get by there. And I was there repeatedly through the 1990s and well on long visits through the first decade of this century. And in the West, the Yeltsin era, of course, is seen as the era of democratic heaven, paradise.
Yeah.
But for the Russian people, exactly as you saw,
Exactly.
it was an era of nightmare. It was much worse than the Great Depression was comparatively in the United States. Even Western demographers, like the very good ones, that acknowledge several million people, at the very least, starved to death under terrible conditions in Russia in those years. The Russians' own estimate, which from what I saw with my own eyes in Moscow and in provincial cities, I think the Russian much higher estimate is much more realistic. Maybe 20 million people died, and most of them were very young children, and most of all, they were older, and not to mention very old, destitute people who simply died in the dark, literally died in the dark, in hundreds of thousands and even millions all across Russia. And it is their survivors, their loved ones, their children, their grandchildren, who are in Russia today. And similarly in China, you had this century of powerlessness from 1840 to 1948, when there were repeated attempts, especially by Sun Yat-sen, who I do not admire for a second, to bring in Western democracy, Western style into China. Now, I don't think it could have worked anyway, but as it was, the British, the French, the United States certainly, and most of all Japan, all worked overtime to undermine and subvert that so-called democracy. As early as the 1920s, Sun, before he dies, designates Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Yeshi, of course, in modern Chinese terminology, as his successor. And Zhang Chang, as they still call him in American Britain, marches dramatically north towards Beijing to unify China. And he carries out a most horrific, monstrous massacre, not just killing people, but torturing them to death in the most horrific of Nazi and Japanese-related ways in Shanghai in 1927. Right. And one of the great works, as you know, in France, you know it very well, but it's totally, actually, I think you know very well, it's totally unknown now and buried in Britain and America, André Malraux's La Condition Humaine is a novel of those years. And the irony is that the heroic Chinese hero of the novel, who is based on one of Malraux's closest friends, who was that close friend in reality? In reality, he survived the massacre, and we learned we knew about him a lot more. He became one of the most powerful and famous people in the world over the next 50 years. Zhou Enlai himself, the longtime prime minister of China and longtime number 2 man in the Communist Party under Mao Zedong. Now, of course, when Mao took over, it was not a paradise overnight. Things got actually monstrously worse. The realistic Chinese scholars who I've looked at, as you know, put the death toll of the Great Famine in the early 1960s during the Great Leap Forward as 80 million people starved to death, not even from deliberate cruelty, but as a direct result of Communist Party administrative and economic stupidity, ignorance, madness, and incompetence. Horrifying. But then in the last 40 years, as China came up, as you say, we have this paradox in China. We have a pseudo-communist system, in effect being authoritarianism, being pragmatic, bringing in a form of highly state-regulated free market capitalism, right. Motivated by pragmatism, as Deng Xiaoping was very explicit about. But there's a political void on top of that. And the regime is able to survive and prosper for almost half a century now. The Neo regime, basically the heirs of Deng Xiaoping, precisely because it flourishes in that contradiction. You had a generation of people, first of all, who remembered the horrors of suffering that they had under communism, as well under the West before. So there were two apparently conflicting ideologies at work in China at the same time. On the economic level, there was a total pragmatic rejection of doctrinaire Marxism and communism. Total. And the Chinese people are still happily rejoicing from the wonderful effects of that. And they have a protected economy at the same time, something I tried to point out 25 years ago. Nobody in Washington listened to me then, and they still, of course, do not. But I tried to point out then that the real secret model and that China was following since the 1970s, since the year of paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, has been, in fact, the same model that the United States followed after the Civil War from 1865 to 1900. Total control at home, industrialization at home, breakneck industrialization, obsession with building industry, and also secondarily, but to a larger degree, actually, I think they compare very impressively in raising general living standards in the robber baron era, in the very cruel industrial America era did. But at the same time, avoiding overseas wars and even avoiding overseas military conquest and expansion, which was a policy explicitly started by, I think, the most underrated of American presidents. And I think, you agree with me on this, Ulysses S. Grant, when he champions democracy in Mexico and flatly cracks down and totally rules out what had always been the Confederate schemes to basically enslave all of the Caribbean and all of Latin America. under a white racist control. In fact, that policy is then revived under two apparently conflicting presidents, Theodore
Martin, we've got
Roosevelt
10
and
minutes left,
Woodrow
or
Wilson.
8 minutes
Yes,
left.
here's
let
the
me just say
contradiction.
this. There was the other option I didn't talk about
Go on,
was
Paul.
Zhao Ziyang. Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng cracked down on the Chinese democracy movement.
Yes,
Zhao
exactly.
Ziyang, Communist Party, was asking to enter into dialogue with them and see if he can begin to reform, working with the students and working with the population. And my view is Zhao Ziyang had the right option because he was going to liberalize in a controlled kind of fashion in the Chinese way. So it wouldn't be a total anarchy or craziness. But he was really isolated and moved out, and they engaged in the crackdown. The crackdown was brutal, but at the same time, Deng Xiaoping said, well, we'll co-opt at the same time we crack down.
Yes,
so
exactly.
They were able to splinter the movement. They were able to push hardcore dissidents underground or kick them out of the country while the Communist Party took over. Now, my view was Zhao Ziyang was on the right path in seeking dialogue and trying to reform the system. Of course, the party didn't accept that and overthrew him. So,
Right.
I mean, there were options. That's all I'm saying. There was an option of reform in China that could have been taken, and it simply wasn't. And this is the problem with all revolutions. The one option, usually the option that once force wins out.
China's been hugely successful, right? Don't you think that maybe economic well-being and prosperity perhaps can precede democracy? So now they're moving on to the next stage. Or are you saying there was an option that they could have had a better political system and this wealth, this astonishing wealth that they've generated?
Yeah, it would have never been a pure democracy. It would have been a reformed. They would have done it
and
by
it would have been better somehow.
and dialogue as opposed to brute force. And that's the point of the book. But at the same time, as I point out, those who were not part of that Communist Party that cracked down were isolated, and they sit there on the outside and watch this monstrous China evolve as a when I was in China, in Shanghai, there were no lights. This is 1989. Now you can't even, and there were no cars. There were just Communist Party people with cars. Now you can't even get down the streets. There's so many cars, and there's lights everywhere. The transformation is just astonishing from 1989, and the Communist Party can claim that. But there was another path that might have led it into a less violent way, but it didn't happen.
And what do you mean by less violent way? Less prosperity, but more freedom? Or
I would maintain it wouldn't have. I would maintain it would mean destruction and ruin, as I saw in the Yeltsin era in Russia in the 1990s.
Well, that's because of the neoliberals who went in there and gutted the state.
But there will always be neoliberals.
Our advisors were as corrupt as theirs.
But they will always emerge in chaos, and ordinary people will suffer. There is someone we should have on, and if we could have one on the dialogue with you too, well, I think it would be wonderful. I don't even know if he's still alive. I hope he is. A genius, I think, who I interviewed in Russia before he came out to the West back in the 1980s. And I think he became an advisor ultimately, and probably enough, to Vladimir Putin. And that was the Armenian Soviet analyst Andranik Migranian, who was a great champion of democracy, but said democracy had your point, Pelle. He said democracy can only emerge when you have a large, stable middle class that is so large and so widespread and stable that people have already developed the habits of responsibility and moderation and self-restraint and negotiation and compromise, and are not being carried off like mad drunks by pure idealistic theories, whatever they are.
The Chinese have that middle class now. I agree.
Exactly.
So maybe they could.
It takes a generation, several generations, for that to emerge before you can have a credible transition to democracy. And he predicted that the Tiananmen protests would fail disastrously. And he even said, I am against them because they will set back true democratization in China for at least one generation, and maybe
you're missing my point. Is Zhao Ziyang would have channeled that movement.
Oh, he couldn't have. No
way.
He could not have. It's the same
but that's what he was talking about. He was actually a neo-authoritarian before his time. But
and would
nobody
have
wanted to
ended
call
up
him
as
that.
one again. Robespierre was a great champion of democracy till he actually took power in the French Revolution. And then it was Madame la Guillotine beheading people by the thousands and inflicting a civil war that killed millions across France in order to make sure everybody did democracy and happiness his way and his way alone. These
Yeah, but
people are
he was
enormously
also against
dangerous.
war with the Brits and all the royalists. So
Precisely,
you had a
exactly,
different
Hall.
movement there.
Exactly. So I think these sweeter than thou, holier than thou types in China as well would have gone that route. So I'm with Professor McGranian all the way on this one.
Mm. Well, I mean, the one thing we know about the Chinese, I mean, they have some of the world's best universities now, and their political
Indeed,
science
they do.
departments. They study two things. One, they study is how to supplant the hegemon of the day without falling into Germany's trap of being encircled in 1914. In other words, they want to avoid what the British managed to do to Germany in 1914 and America doing that to them. And the second thing is how to avoid the Russian disaster, which was democracy without wealth. And so the Yeltsin, I don't know what the Russians think. You guys, I mean,
Yeltsin
Marty,
was a disaster. I was a Gorbachev man. That's authoritarianism moderating, but Gorbachev had his faults too, and you could claim that he started the problem.
Paul, I was much worse than you, and it embarrasses me to say so. You are a Gorbachev man, and at first I was too, of course. But I did much worse. I was taken in by Yeltsin, and that was
I never was.
Exactly. I know you weren't, but I was. Live and learn. Exactly. As long as he was out of power, he seemed to me to be an admirable, heroic champion of democracy. But as you and I both saw all too much of, once he got power, it was catastrophe all the way. Yeah, and I would say Sun Yat-sen was like that in China too. Wonderful theoretical ideas. In practice, did not have a clue.
Well, also because the Americans and the Brits were on different sides there. The Americans supported Sun Yat-sen, the Brits didn't, and there was a clash between who they couldn't coordinate strategy was one issue from the external aspect, and that was, I think, at the roots of the problem, because imperial powers didn't know what to do with China.
Hall, just in the show notes, you were going to say something about Hamlet because we had this fantastic show. Can you tell that story in less than 4 minutes?
Well, I was going to read a poem because Marty inspired me because of this discussion. And I have this poem, which is based on a true story in 1975 when I was in London. I had just seen Hamlet, and the Hamlet had actually forgotten his lines at to be or not to be. He just stopped and froze. And the whole audience says, what's the problem? And so I wrote a poem related to that. And what Marty gave me, but it'll take me I don't know how much time we have if I read it. What Marty gave me was gave me a reason for him to block his thinking, because suddenly he realized it wasn't Shakespeare that wrote this stuff. It was Chris Marlowe. And that's so I rechanged the structure of the poem to fit this in, and then I ended the poem with that. I could do it another time.
Let's do it next time. Then.
Also, we were in London at exactly the same time. We must have been at some of the same Shakespearean performances without realizing it. Exactly.
Well, we were also in DC. We were probably at the same place.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Now you're on this podcast. What an extraordinary.
It's too funny.
What's the word called? Synchronicity or whatever it's called.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's too funny.
All right, so we'll wind up there.
At the time, I was over at the left-wing Institute for Policy Studies, and he was over at the.
But now you kind of converged in a way. I mean, I don't know if I'm left-wing or right-wing anymore. I mean,
Exactly.
No, I'm not either. No,
exactly. None of us are.
I don't dig that stuff.
Isaiah Berlin would have loved that. He loved it. He was always saying that ideas and political movements, well, you know this, Hall, that they evolve, that they don't stay the same, that it's ridiculous to say, the Freemasons were the Illuminati of 1786. Even if they think they are, they aren't.
That's right. They're all different. Each generation changes the ideology.
Exactly.
Anyway, folks, so listeners, viewers, I hope you've come away with a slightly more we're only dipping our toes into this vast, massive Chinese.
Oh, it's a big vast.
Society,
next time,
5 times bigger than
we have to
America,
start with
3
you
times
reading
bigger
the
than
poem.
Europe.
Well, that's what I wanted to do, but it didn't end up like that. So next
time, definitely.
Next time. All right. Thank you so
It's
much,
dedicated to
gentlemen.
you, Morris.
All right. Take care. Thank
Thank
you
you,
so much.
Hall.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.